And here's where we start to get to the problem. The problem we're going to face is that our debt has gotten so big that even a small change in interest rates that we have to pay on that debt. Remember, I talked to you about how we have to pay interest on the debt. Remember that? Well, that interest, it depends on interest rates. Anybody heard any talk about inflation lately? Inflation is the rise in prices over time, and that affects interest rates that we must pay on what we borrow. Well, this is a chart here that shows you the interest rate, average interest rate the U.S. government paid on its debt in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. In the 70s, some of you were around at that time. I was a little boy. We paid about 10% in the 70s. Anybody remember that? And in the 80s, it was about 11%. And in the 90s, when I bought my first house, and paid an interest rate of roughly 96. And the interest rate was 7 3/4. And my father-in-law, who of course was a generation before me, said, "Oh, that's a great rate. Lock in, get that rate." In the 2000s, it was about 4%, and in the 2010s, it averaged about 2.5%. So the question is this: what happens when interest rates go back up? What happens if interest rates go back to the average of this from 1970 to 2000, which is 9.5%? Let's look at some graphs here. Interest payments. Imagine that you make $100,000 a year. We're going to use the $100,000 figure to represent that $3 trillion, right? That's the government's income. Let's say you make $100,000. Well, at 2.5%, the interest is $675 billion. What does that mean? It means you're paying $23,000 in credit card interest on a $100,000 income. Okay? But if rates go to 5%, just 5%, then we're paying 40% of our income on interest at 5%. You see, we've let the number get so big. The debt is so big now. Remember what the Bible said. Sooner or later, you're going to be its slave. At 5%, you're paying $40,000 of a $100,000 income on credit card interest. Interest, not principal. We have paid no principal. At 7%, you got 67%. $67,000 of your $100,000 salary goes to credit card interest at just 7%. At 9%, you got 80% of your income, and at 11%, that's all. But remember, I told you we're already at $30 trillion. And the fools in Congress want to spend even more. So that number is not 11% now, that number's 10. And every trillion we add, that number ticks down. As rates return to normal, historical levels, U.S. debt payments will overwhelm its income. At some point, the game is going to be up. At some point, investors will recognize what is happening. At some point, somebody's going to put an article out on the Wall Street Journal or on Barron's or somewhere, and they're going to go, "Wait a minute. Those Americans, they're spending 60% of their income on interest." And then what will happen? What happened when COVID hit? Fear. Right through the whole world, just right through the world. And what happens when people get afraid with their money? What do they do with it? And then the money's gone. The money will dry up. And all of a sudden, remember, we're bringing in $3 trillion, and we're spending $4 trillion. So $1 trillion disappears overnight because we can't borrow it anymore. But now we've got $2 or $3 trillion of interest payments on a $3 trillion income. Do you see how this is playing out? You don't have to be a prophet here to see where this is headed.